Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Andrew Chakhoyan, who is a Ukrainian American based in the Netherlands and is a vocal and articulate champion of Ukraine and, of course, in its just cause in the war. I'm going to ask Andrew to introduce himself a little bit and ask about his motivations. But to start with, welcome to Silicon Curtain.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It's amazing to join you in this conversation. I'm becoming a big fan of your show, and then you had phenomenal guests on. Um, I guess to sum up my background, I was born in Donetsk, and my hometown has been occupied for over 10 years. But I spent my entire life in kind of in various geographies, a third of it in Ukraine, a third in the US, and a third in Western Europe. Netherlands is my sixth or seventh country of residence. So I'm Armenian, Jewish by ethnicity, Ukrainian by birth, American by passport, Dutch by residency. So my identity is quite confused. But what is not confused is my views on what Russia is doing, my sense of right and wrong when it comes to what's happening now in Europe, and I think it really is the most important conversation of our time. Is can the world really comprehend what's going on? Can we stand up and address the belligerence of a country that just wages war because it chooses to? Maybe we'll get a bit more in my background. One word to sum it up in terms of my professional career is diplomacy. I've done diplomacy in various angles. I've served in the U.S. government. I worked at the World Economic Forum in Geneva, dealing with the Russian government, Ukrainian government. I've done corporate diplomacy, but that's basically a summary.
Well, that's fascinating, isn't it? Because, of course, Armenia is, through its long history, also very much, I would say, subjugated or influenced by the Russian Empire. So you'll have that struggle there to emerge from the orbit of Russian imperialism. Georgia is going through that same struggle. And unfortunately, we don't know the outcome to that. Do you sense these historical echoes and commonality with other nations that are struggling to emerge from the Russian imperial structure?
The key question is self-awareness, right? Is the countries got their independence when the Soviet Union collapsed, but does it mean that they immediately were endowed with self-awareness across the population? Because I've lived through the end of Soviet Union, and I can tell you from day to day, nothing really changed. I was Homo Sovieticus is a good term. So in 1991, I was still a kid, but the life went on. I was living in one country and then living in another country. But did my worldview evolve immediately? Was I always self-aware? Do I understand that struggle for independence? There were always Ukrainians that struggled for freedom, but was it the true story for every citizen? And same, I suppose, is for Armenia or Georgia. There's this another paradox or another layer, as people genuinely fondly remember their youth, and it doesn't matter. Things were great when I was young, and then for people for whom their youth was Soviet times, and they weren't the most informed, most aware of what Soviet Union really was, and they associate that era with all the good things, and now it's harder to let go.
Now, you're extremely prominent on X, as we have to call it now, or Twitter, as I still prefer to call it. And I've been aware of your comments for some time, but what really grabbed my attention was the op-ed that you wrote in Politico. And I think it's a really interesting point. You say here that the West isn't to blame for Russia starting criminal wars. but it will take the whole of the West coming together to end it. But this is interesting because it really addresses one of the principal Russian propagandistic tropes. And unfortunately, it's one that seems to work not just on Z patriots and those who are in favor of the war, it seems to work rather well with many in the so-called liberal opposition as well. And this is the idea that the West is equally culpable for Russia's aggression. They seek to deflect any responsibility or agency within that. And they're happy to be called Russian when it's associated with good things. And of course, they wash their hands of it when it's associated with criminality. So why did you pick this particular topic? And what's been the sort of impact of that article that you wrote?
Thanks for raising this. It's this idea um, of appeasement. I think that's quite central, and it's central to history, central to what's going on now with Russia, how it invaded Georgia, how it invaded Chechnya. It's easy to dismiss Russian war on Chechen people as an internal matter in Russia, but that really never was. It was a harbinger that we've seen unfold over time. But it's also, as Russia keeps demonstrating to the world what it will do, the world keeps pretending that somehow things will just solve themselves. And I've been wondering about this question of appeasement. Why can we not act on what is obvious, right? It's if we look back at history and say, appeasing Hitler was clearly a mistake, right? It was semi-obvious where things were going, but we chose to keep pretending that somehow it'll just all work out. Uh, and then even with the hindsight, now I have this thought experiment that maybe it'll be interesting for the listeners to consider. Imagine we take Neville Chamberlain and give him access to time machine, and he goes on a few years forward to, I don't know, 1942 or so, and sees like how bad things really get, what Hitler really is, what he's doing, how terrible the war is, the Holocaust. He gets all the evidence, he sees all of it, and then transfers back to his uh, position of power. And can he act differently? Can he do anything other than what he was doing, being who he was at the time and the context in which he operated? It's really both upsetting and kind of semi-inevitable that probably nothing much would have changed. Could he mobilize society? Could this awareness of where appeasement, where it leads, could that allow a different course? And same we're watching now. Like we look back at World War II, we know how we failed. We by that I mean the collective free world or collective West or alliance of democracies. Anything we name our big grouping of kind of civilized countries looking at it, seeing that those mistakes were made, we're making them again. But can we do anything different? And it's hard to say, can we or can we not?
And you make the point that escalation management, as it's been termed, this incremental drip feed supply of weapons, it's not just down to bureaucratic inertia. It's not just down to the timidity of our managerial leaders, although these are clearly factors, but it is a strategy. It's a strategy of appeasement light. Now, of course, there are a lot of arguments as to why that is. If you're incredibly cynical, you might say, well, this is a classic military strategy to attrit your enemy, to break the Russians down over a long period of time and kind of boil the frog. I kind of suspect that our leaders, in their timidity, that's far too bold a strategy for them to adopt. It's also a very, very cruel one. But they certainly do seem to, and I hear this both externally and also from many people that talk to sort of bureaucrats and decision makers in Washington, Berlin, and so on. They are terrified at the idea of Russian collapse. They're terrified at the idea of some kind of nuclear apocalypse. And yet, what's curious is that when you look at some of the Russian propaganda narratives and the distribution patterns, these narratives that are designed to instill fear in our decision makers, to instill caution, and which prevent them from delivering what Ukraine needs for victory, these very narratives are often propagated by Russians within the regime themselves. What's your view on this? And how have we let this kind of coercive manipulation lead to what you've termed appeasement light?
Everything boils down to the phrase that we're using, with Ukraine as long as it takes. As soon as that becomes a grounding phrase on which the policy is built, there is no commitment to victory as long as it takes, as long as exactly what takes. On one hand, yes, we will support Ukraine, but to what end? And like you said, Jonathan, this it's cruel, this policy. It's not clear what why are we drip feeding this aid to achieve which goal exactly? Attrition, it's as a military strategy, but let military folks decide how they prosecute the war. But the policy of by itself, this phrase to me is very upsetting, and not only from the perspective of a Ukrainian, where I think that's a betrayal, right? It's like, why is the world saying as long as it takes, as long as who knows what takes? But as an American or as a now living in Europe, in the Western Europe, I wonder, what's our enlightened self-interest? Is it to allow this to escalate, to grow more and more and more, versus to try to end it? And there is this complete mistaken approach, right? It's we think that we're escalation managing, the phrase that is often used by trying to take small steps, right? And the reality is, escalation management is what prompts Russia to raise the stakes every time. We escalation managed when Russia entered Georgia. We thought, well, maybe that was Georgia's fault. Maybe Saakashvili was provoked Putin, quote unquote, and that was an easy excuse not to act. But then after that, Georgian territories were annexed is not the word, but they are occupied by Russia. They're turned into this pretend independent republics that are not in any way independent. Then we had Crimea. Same thing is, oh, maybe there's historical context. Historical context is irrelevant. The only thing that matters is national treaties. That's how the borders exist everywhere, because every single country in Europe can make claims on any territory anywhere using some historical context. And that does not matter. Russia signed a treaty with Ukraine recognizing mutual borders, and it violated them. But we were comfortable, finding excuses. But that's escalation. We saw escalation from invading Georgia, creating the pretend republics, then annexing Crimea, then sending troops into Donbass, then an airliner gets shot, and we know it's Russians, but we keep trying to find some excuse, trying to find some way out to not deal with it. And because escalation keeps happening, and we think we're de-escalating, and now from 2014, 8 more years, we keep trying to de-escalate, and yet we get escalation in response. So my point is if we here in Amsterdam and Berlin and London and Washington, if we want this war to end, saying we need to somehow do the same thing, expect different result, we can be certain that the war will expand if we keep doing what we're doing, which is not committed to Ukrainian victory. If we commit to Ukrainian victory, if Putin understands that Russia understands that this war cannot be won because the West is collectively committed to making sure Ukraine wins. Then the calculus changes and the war does not expand. It's really obvious to everyone who's paying attention, but acting on this knowledge is hard. And I understand, I empathize. If I were president, prime minister, I'd struggle with this as well. But still, the answer is very obvious. If we want this to end, the only way it ends and doesn't get bigger, it doesn't get worse, is if Ukraine is given everything it needs to kick the aggressors out.
And in the conversation I recently had with both Ben Hodges and Jake Bro, we talked about the idea that ultimately the objective to avoid World War III, which Western governments perceive as a risk, whether it is or not, whether that risk is minuscule, they're going to place that objective over and above the survival of Ukraine, whereas Ukraine and Ukrainians are going to place their survival above all else, which is absolutely right and proper. And of course, Russia is manipulating and using this idea. Here's maybe a difficult question because you understand some of these mechanisms of diplomacy. You cut across sort of cultures, both national cultures, but also business cultures and so on. And I've had the impression that until recently, Ukraine and its leadership has been overly deferent to, let's say, Washington. They have agreed to play this game of escalation management. They've been forced into fighting a war of attrition, which does not play to their strengths. They put up with the ammunition famine for a lengthy period of time, and it's cost them absolutely dearly. With Kursk, it seems to me they've made a conscious decision that they're not going to play that game. They're going to reset the rules. They're going to do something surprising. They're going to keep it secret from not just adversaries, but also allies. And they're going to do it based on their understanding of Russian mindset and the fragility of the Russian system. And they're going to base it on their interests, which is victory, not a slow motion defeat based on conventional attritional warfare. Do you get that sense that the deference, which I think was catastrophic for Ukraine, is starting to slip? And what has caused it to happen? And will it go much further potentially?
It's without being a military expert, it's really hard to judge. But I think deference may not be the right word here. I feel like if Ukrainians wanted to prosecute this war differently, just didn't have the tools, right? The country doesn't. It's trying to rebuild its military production capacity, but it depends on Western support. One thing that I think you're right to say that Kursk incursion shows you that the war, the way it's imagined in the West, it won't go this way, right? It's not the slow burn and let's hope for the best. Let's just sit here and make sure again that nothing bad happens, but bad things are happening every single day. Today, they're bombing center of Kharkiv. Russian bombers are dropping, 1-ton bombs on apartment buildings in the city center. It's unimaginable. There's one thing that is also, I don't know if like, the lack of understanding of what's happening. It's the Russians came to Ukraine to kill Ukrainians for being Ukrainian. That's their goal. There's no other objective. It's not to capture. It's not to, it's not a game, right? It's every Ukrainian understands that if they don't fight, the Russians will just kill them. And here, there's in the Western Europe, it's even hard for people to imagine that somebody will try to come to you, try to kill you, and then you'd have to fight back. It's just outside of anybody's frame of reference now, because no one expects any neighbor to have this kind of ambition. Defending the homeland idea just sounds so odd. It's just, postmodern frame of references doesn't allow for this kind of thing. We live in this post-heroic world, and none of this makes any sense. It's not a game for Ukrainians. It's like the Russians are literally there to kill them. So what are they supposed to do? And 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 the restrictions are real. If Ukraine was to use US made missile outside of the parameters provided, who knows what happens? And there's US Congress was divided for a while. It just, who knows how things work out. If you taking that gamble was always too much of a risk for Ukraine. So on one hand, it's stuck between rock and hard place, trying to figure out what to do with all the constraints. But like you said, it's Kursk incursion shows you that Ukraine needs to do what needs to do to expel the aggressor, find a way out, other than the slow burn that it's just not, it's not working.
Here's the extraordinary irony, I think, which is that American caution, in particular, is also driven by the electoral cycle. It's driven by internal politics. The ammunition famine was driven by domestic issues and domestic electoral concerns, largely, without getting into the whole, MAGA versus etc. We won't get into that partisan subject, but essentially internal political concerns drive a lot of stuff. Worries about the increase in gas fuel prices, worries about unexpected things happening that could cede your opponent some kind of talking point. These things, unfortunately, do influence foreign policy. And here's the extraordinary irony, I think, which I'd love to hear your thoughts on, which is that while Ukraine was buckling down in the attritional war, support for Ukraine in the US polls was going down when Ukraine was perceived as in a stalemate, perceived as losing, not innovating, and where Russian narratives were holding sway, support went down, which of course is going to further restrict, any kind of vote and support for armaments and munitions. Kursk has seen a huge leap. I mean, unfortunately, the cleansing of the Black Sea, of the Russian Black Sea fleet, that's a tremendous victory, but it didn't really cut through in the media. Kursk has, and it's seen popularity on both sides of the aisle. Traditional Republican and Democrat has shot up. So it's almost as if that by taking the initiative, Ukraine is also able to influence the political dynamic, which in turn may have some kind of positive feedback loop on the American political system. Shouldn't be that way, but I'd be interested to hear your perception of what's going on here.
I think you nailed it. It's when anybody's trying to assess the success or failure of Kursk incursion, a lot of it is military analysis, right? Saying have the Russians moved the troops and has a goal X, Y, or Z been achieved? But that's not. There's so many connecting points. Like you said, it's the victory or the momentum matters hugely, and the one big gain is the showing the emptiness of the red lines, right? So of all the red lines, this must be the reddest when troops enter Russia, right? It sounds like any government should treat this as an important development, whereas Kremlin is downplaying this. The phrase I want to use for Kursk incursion is finally we're seeing efforts to de-escalate this war. That's how I'm interpreting it. Ukraine is now showing that you can de-escalate Russian aggression, because anything up until now, fear of provoking Moscow provokes Moscow. Now, showing there's no fear, showing that the initiative can be taken. It's not that we will always be operating in the frame that Kremlin sets for decision making, saying you have option B or you have option A and you choose, but we frame the decisions for you. Now, Ukraine has turned the tables. And to me, that's, if we properly identify this as a real step towards de-escalation, a real step towards preventing World War III, and we acknowledge what has been achieved, that the Moscow response has not been, oh, let's announce mobilization. Let's declare war, because up until now, this was called a special military operation. So you cannot even use the word war inside Russia, and you risk going to jail for calling what Russia is doing a war on Ukraine. He's not, he is, Kremlin has a military alliance with China, Central Asian, this Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. They could have called on this grouping to say, oh, we've been invaded, which they can tell that story. It's, of course, this is not an invasion, because between warring countries, there is no border, there's a front line. So this is by no means an invasion. If you say, anyone of sober mind, if you say, do Ukrainians, do they want Kursk? Do they want to be there? Or do they just want the Russians out? If you ask Ukrainians, can you please go home? The war ends, the Russians leave your country. They'll gladly do it. There's no intention for Ukraine to go and conquer Russia. Even if Russia was weak and Ukraine was strong, and there's nobody wants to go and march on Moscow, not a single country in the world. And so whenever Putin tells himself or his people that NATO is a threat, that's absolute BS. So when we say what has happened is a real step showing that de-escalation is possible, because right now Kremlin response is actually sweep it under the carpet, tell the Russian people that's no problem, let's look somewhere else, let's worry about Pavel Durov getting arrested. Like, anything else is a bigger story in Russia than foreign troops on Russian land. And that is, to me, real de-escalation. Escalation management, when it works, by entering Russia, Ukraine shows that the conflict can be de-escalated by not providing Ukraine with weapons, by placing strange limits on how the weapons can be used. Berlin, Washington, London, Paris, whoever is not allowing the use of weapons as Ukraine sees fit, escalates this conflict.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Because I've been monitoring and looking a lot of the output of Russian propagandists, and as unpleasant as it is to listen to their shrill and hateful voices, there seems to be a bit of a change in the focus. Previously, whenever they talked about the Ukrainian army or any progress that Ukrainians have made in the war, I mean, they don't tend to talk about Kharkiv and Kherson that much, but if they talk about sort of other aspects, they will use dehumanizing language. Whenever Ukrainians do something, gain an advantage, they'll say, oh, well, they'll treat Ukrainians as proxies for American power and American foreign policy. They will deny agency to Ukrainians. And that's been a fairly common pattern, really, since 2014 onwards. And I'm sure you'll say probably earlier as well, but in the context of war 2014. In the last 2 weeks, I've seen several propagandists actually praising, with a note of fear in their voices, praising Ukrainian military prowess, and not saying that it's as a result of this or that or allies or whatever, but directly talking about the Ukrainian success and starting to berate their own leaders for failure. This, to me, is an extraordinary change in mindset. And as well as the de-escalation you talk about, I think this points towards how to end the war as well, in that it will only come when Russians fear Ukrainians, not because Ukrainians have inflicted, terrible suffering or they're brutal or whatever, but they simply understand that Ukrainians punch back harder than they can if provoked. It's a very, very basic psychological mechanism, but I think our Western policymakers have not really understood this mindset. Is it too simplistic, or do you think there's something in?
Yeah, 100%. The indecisiveness, hesitation, fear provokes Moscow. Strength deters Moscow. This is obvious as day and night. And we are failing to grasp this. And Ukrainians are testing Russia and telling Putin that you cannot win, or the cost of escalating is going to go higher. And I think that's where the war ends, is when the calculus in the Kremlin becomes obvious. We cannot win. We cannot gain by prosecuting this war. It's going to get worse for us. It's also one thing that I wanted to try to convey to the listeners is this paradox of Russia losing the war. It's the idea that what happens if Russia loses. I think such a manipulation. Russia will have lost nothing. If the borders are restored, Russia will have lost nothing. You know, no one wants to march on Moscow and conquer Russia. No one has those desires. And restoring the borders is actually in the interest of the Russian people, because maybe then they'll have a chance of at some, positive trajectory. Anything other than that is bad for Ukraine, bad for Europe, bad for Russia. And this idea that Russia loses the war. Let's imagine, Ukraine is given more tools, prosecutes brilliant strategy, gets to Belgorod, gets to Kursk, and Russia, Kremlin wakes up and says, okay, let's end it. Let's just, go back to our borders. We call it done. What happens after the fighting stops, no matter on whose conditions, in which way? Putin will declare victory no matter what, because he owns all information channels. The tiny fraction of people with kind of sufficient understanding, they already know what's going on. They will know it regardless. But even when Russians are kicked out, it will still be a victory speech in the Kremlin. And you cannot do it in the West, because it is hard for us to again grasp controlling the information space fully, 100%. And even if people don't believe you, if Putin announces victory, and I say, so many Russian citizens kind of think it sounds odd, they'll go along with it, because it's much easier to go along with it than not. So when we fear this idea of what happens if Russia lost the war, it'll just go on. It might actually be good for it, because it will give even a bigger lie. It's the bigger the lie, the better control the center of power has on this population of kind of this imperial setup that the country has. And it's this misunderstanding of what happens, how helping Ukraine win brings the war to the end. If we don't see it, because we apply our kind of understanding that's grounded in what we know about ourselves, rather than how we understand Russia. So if Ukraine became more and more successful, and that led to just peace, Ukraine will declare victory in the independent media, and there'll be folks questioning, is it fair? Should we demand more reparations? And there'll be a debate, and Russia will declare victory, and there'll be no debate. But that's when it ends. If there's weakness, there'll be raising of stakes by the Kremlin. There'll be more death, more destruction. This will expand geographically or in any other way, unless we start seeing the light that Ukrainian victory is the only path to a lasting peace in Europe.
There's just sort of two questions. Well, I have a million questions, but there's just two questions we've got time for left. One is you wrote a really, I think, compelling statement and question, in fact, in Twitter. That was based on something that Gabriela Slansbergis has said, and that is how everybody in a position of authority that understand what's going on, that understands the importance of pushing back on Russia and supporting Ukraine, that there's a certain onus on everybody to speak out, and where they have any kind of influence or leverage to take action where they can. What's your advice to any decision makers, policymakers, and so on, who may not have Ukraine at the top of their list of priorities? What should they be doing to hasten a Ukrainian victory?
I'd say two things. One is really understand the self-interest, because if one is in a position of power in any given country, they've been elected to defend the interest of that country, to think of the people, of the population of citizens, not necessarily of Ukrainians or Russians, but the country they're in. And the more they think about that interest, the more the person will understand that if Russia is not defeated in Ukraine, things only get worse. They get much, much worse, because then the war of conquest becomes normalized again. The idea that one country can just invade the other because it's stronger or bigger becomes normalized. I think Yuval Harari, the guy written *Sapiens*, put out a really strong op-ed early on in 2022, in February or March, saying the long peace ends now if Russia is not defeated, if the aggressor is able to profit from aggression. That brings us back to the military budgets or defense budgets of old age. Now the NATO standard is 2%. Imagine this getting to 10 or 20%, because the risk of getting invaded becomes real. And if your neighbor is spending more, you are spending more. And suddenly we have no money for pension, education, health, or anything, because we now have to arm to the teeth, because the invasions are now possible and they're normalized. This world in which the aggressor is not defeated is just awful. And this is an illusion that I feel Europe has walked into, is this idea of pacifism taken to extreme, where it was true up until it stopped being true, saying if we in Germany and France and Netherlands and Italy disarm, if we have fewer arms, then the conflict is less and less likely, and let us all go in that direction. If the entire world was going in that direction, Europe would have shown true leadership by saying, we lead by doing. We disarm, we spend less money on this, and the war is distant past. But that was true until it stopped being true, until Russia invaded Georgia, until Russia captured Crimea. That had to be a wake-up call. You cannot remain delusional and say the fact that we wish for peace and we want peace and we are not intending to fight anyone and we're just going to keep disarming while the war of conquest is normalized. That was a huge mistake, and so it only gets worse. That's one lesson. Now no, that's where we need to cut. I forget what second point would have been.
Well, it leads to another interesting question, because really, for the last 2 decades, I mean, I have kept a fairly close eye on this, even when I wasn't doing the channel, and it's always been an interest. And Eastern European voices have been incredibly vocal since the fall of the Soviet Union, basically begging other Europeans not to take their eye off the ball, not to completely surrender their security to Russia. And of course, things like Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, there were a lot of Eastern European voices saying, this is dangerous. You're creating serious dependencies on the Russian system, and this idea that you can civilize Russia through trade is not going to work. And those voices were ignored and maligned for a long time. People are just about starting to wake up and listen to Poles and people in the Baltics and so on. It seems, unfortunately, that Ukrainians who are telling us the raw, painful truth that they're experiencing, Ukrainians are not accorded the same status, whether it be in academia or the media, as potentially others who come from, let's say, the Anglo-Saxon world, etc. This has to change, doesn't it? Ukrainian truth, Ukrainian witness to Russian aggression and their understanding of the Russian mindset has to be listened to and I think taken into consideration when formulating foreign policy.
Absolutely. That's exactly the problem is the question of agency is whenever Ukraine was discussed until wherever I can remember, it was always in the context of the Western Europe and the Russia and the 50 million or 40 million Ukrainians. What their interest was, if they wanted to move in the westward direction or eastward, that was never a question. It was just stripping 40 million people of their agency was a huge both mistake and just yeah. How did we do this? We wouldn't allow other folks to discuss our countries and pretend that we're not there or we have no wishes. It's just what what the former metropole wants is more important. But I think brings me actually to the second point. So one is for Western leaders, one is recognize that failing to defeat Russia and Ukraine is gonna cost everybody in terms of security and prosperity. But the second one is really sit down to understand what Russia is and stop thinking of Russia as a country. Because if I'm a prime minister of the Netherlands, I look at the Netherlands, I see a country. I look at Russia, it's a line on the map, and I see a country. And automatically I imagine national interests. I imagine that the government has some kind of interest. And that's already a mistake because there's no national interest in Russia because there's no nation. It's this empire that is not self-aware. When we had India and England were one empire, it was obvious that India was not England, even though it was British Empire. But because Russia is continuous, it seems like well, maybe it is all one nation, one people, one country, but it's not. And so if anybody wants to formulate proper policy or know what to do, the number one priority is to know what Russia is. And if we grasp the idea that it cannot but invade, it just the only that's what drives it, right? Is to tell Russian people what Russia is for, Russia must invade. It's this paradox in which the country is stuck. It's this cycle. It's almost inevitable. It's not the first genocide Russia is attempting on Ukraine in the 30s. Last century, Holodomor was more or less the same as is trying to take the willpower, the national idea from Ukraine and quash it. Right? That was the intention, and now it's happening again. It's not an aberration. It's what Russia does, and it's very difficult for any modern leader in in civilized world or in the collective West to grasp this. But it's understanding Russia as an empire, as this Moscow is a center, and it must push down on everybody everywhere. The resources are in Siberia. To be able to extract those resources and concentrate them on Moscow, it needs to be telling itself some kind of story. And this story, I give you an interesting anecdote from my days at the WEF, the World Economic Forum in Geneva. I traveled to Moscow like you have. I met with government officials. I've traveled to Kiev, Central Asia, doing this work, dealing with governments. And then I remember in some high-level conversations, there was an instruction from Putin came down to all the functionaries to figure out the national idea. How do we build this national idea? And there was a struggle, and I couldn't grasp it. Like, to me, it was just, what kind of question is this? I just, felt very strange. And now I think I have it. The national idea of Russia is invasion, subjugation, humiliation. It needs to do this. And when we say Russia, we have to again remember it's this Moscow as this center of this empire that needs to put everybody down everywhere, and to make sure everybody bows to Moscow. For that, it needs to invade, subjugate, and humiliate. And as soon as that runs out, it needs to then invade again. Or else, how could it explain to folks in Tatarstan why their oil money needs to be all sent to Moscow? And that's a hard thing to explain. So you need to keep delivering that message. Is Moscow is in charge of all those distant lands that it captured, and what's the reason? Is because it's the greatness of whatever the stories that they're telling themselves. But it's understanding Russia as this big, 20% of land mass is one country, and seeing this as an empire that will invade is important, because then that that's what it will do. And then so we have to deal with it. If we normalize it and again think of it as a nation state, then we think it has the same motives as a nation state, and then we miss the big picture, and we don't know what to do or how to act because we misdiagnosed what we're dealing with.
And the very last question, I think, is going to be a short one that really links off that. There is conversation, there is talk about certain policymakers in the West still eyeing a potential reset with Russia. Now, it stretches credibility, whether that could be with the current regime. I think that would be a tough one to sell to their publics. But if there was to be a regime change, even if it wasn't to be, a fundamental systemic change, my fear is that a reset is still on the agenda for many people in Washington and indeed Berlin. And who knows? I mean, once they pile in, I think everyone else will have a go too. And of course, people like China, India, and so on don't really care. They're mindful of secondary sanctions, but they have no real qualms about dealing with Russia on a commercial basis. Would it be a criminally negligent decision to contemplate a reset with Russia, at least for a generation?
It's what's Russia going to be after it's defeated? This is a $1 million question, but the reset is in a way how we think about that place. But how can Russia become something other than what it is? I think the only path is learning its own history, right? How's Germany a model state today? It was occupied after it was defeated, and it went through the Nazification in a real serious way, right? It was Nuremberg trials, education, self-awareness. This was important, and that's why the government today is very responsible. On any measure, you look at Germany, people prosper. And in Russia, it never learned its history. If you ask, I don't know, 99 out of 100 Russians don't know that Russia and Nazi Germany started the World War II as allies, because in the Russian telling, the World War II started in 1941. But if Russia doesn't learn its own history, it cannot be anything else. It cannot be anything different. And then if that's the case, how do you reset relations? You can have relations with adversaries, or you can have relations with countries that chose a different path, but there is, the policies of containment. I don't know what they'll be named, but the bigger question is, can Russia be something other than what it is? And to me, the answer is definitive only if and when it is able to learn its history. And it cannot learn its history until it is defeated. And that would be, as Timothy Snyder correctly says, Ukrainian victory is in the interest of the Russian people. Absolutely. It would be a big win for Russian people, a Ukrainian victory. And so that, if we wish them well, that's again what the West must do, is commit to Ukrainian victory.
Well, Andrew, it's a huge pleasure speaking to you. I think you've brought together so many ideas that have been bubbling up in numerous episodes, and you sort of brought them together in such a sort of logical, consistent way that I think anyone who is historically aware could not possibly argue with. So thank you for coming on the podcast. It's a huge pleasure. I'd love to do this again and explore some sort of other topics as the situation unfolds. But for now, thanks so much for sharing your insight and experience with us.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And thank you for standing with Ukraine.